Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into something kind of strange.
Oh,
We're talking cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS for short.
yeah. CHS, it can be pretty wild, especially for folks who use cannabis, like daily users.
Right, because we usually hear about cannabis helping with nausea, not causing it, but CHS flips that idea on its head.
Exactly. So we'll be looking at some research papers, and there's a really interesting news story that gives a personal perspective on it.
Yeah, that story really brings it to life.
Mm.
So CHS, it's basically these recurring bouts of super intense nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. And it seems to primarily hit people who are, like you said, long-term daily cannabis users.
And it's actually a relatively newly defined condition, which makes it all the more mysterious.
Right, researchers are still trying to figure out exactly why it happens and why some cannabis users get hit with it and others don't.
Totally. Like, what's the trigger? It's a puzzle, for sure.
For sure. So let's jump into this story about this Canadian guy who started experiencing CHS back in 2003.
Which is, like, crazy because that was a whole year before CHS was even officially a thing.
Right, like they didn't even have a name for it yet.
Yeah.
So can you imagine? His first episode, he's hit with this insane vomiting, ends up in the ER.
And they just chalked it up to drinking, misdiagnosed him completely.
Wow, so he's probably thinking, okay, bad night, but then it keeps happening.
Yeah, he ended up dealing with these recurring bouts of vomiting for 17 years.
17 years, man, that's a long time. And get this, one of his worst attacks lasted 6 weeks.
6 weeks. Oh, man.
Yeah, and the pain was so bad, he said it was worse than breaking his femur.
Wow, I can't even imagine.
And the weirdest thing, he found relief, at least temporary relief, by taking hot baths.
That is weird, but it's actually pretty common among people with CHS.
So we know it's linked to long-term daily cannabis use, but why does it single some people out? Like, what's the deal with that?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Why some people and not others? Why does it sometimes pop up after years of using cannabis without any issues?
Right, it's almost like boom, out of nowhere.
Exactly, and it can be super unpredictable. A gastroenterologist who's been researching CHS has seen it develop in people in their 50s, 60s, even later.
After using cannabis their whole lives.
Yeah, it's like something just suddenly switches on.
That's kind of freaky, especially for those who use cannabis regularly. So what are some of the leading theories about what might cause this? What are researchers looking into?
Well, one theory focuses on THC, obviously the psychoactive component in cannabis. The thing about THC is it's fat soluble, meaning it can hang out in the body for a long time, like months.
Okay, so it's stored up in there, and they're thinking stress might trigger the release of this stored THC, leading to a CHS episode.
That's the idea, like this buildup and then bam, stress sets it off.
So like a THC time bomb. Interesting.
Right. And another theory, and this one's fascinating, is that maybe cannabis kind of plays a double game with our bodies.
A double game. What do you mean?
Well, at first it might suppress nausea because of how it interacts with the brain. But then over time it might start irritating the digestive system, and that leads to the vomiting.
So it's like it helps you out at first, but then it backstabs you later.
Yeah, kind of a tricky relationship. But we got to remember, cannabis isn't just THC, right? There's a whole bunch of other cannabinoids and terpenes in there, and those could be playing a role too.
True. It's a whole complex system in that plant. Which makes me wonder, could the potency of cannabis products, especially concentrates like wax or shatter, be a factor in CHS? Because those are, well, pretty intense.
That's a great point, and it's something that researchers are looking into. Canada's Cannabis Act doesn't actually regulate THC potency in those concentrated extracts.
Really? So they can be super strong.
Oh, yeah. They can have upwards of 90% THC, which is a huge jump from the average 15–20% you see in dried cannabis.
That's a massive difference.
I know.
It makes you wonder if there's a connection between the rise in these high-potency products and the emergence of CHS.
Right. Definitely a connection worth investigating. And speaking of investigations, let's take a look at some of the research being done to understand and hopefully treat CHS.
Before we do, I'm just curious, if someone's listening and they think, hey, maybe this is me, maybe I have CHS, what should they do? What's the first step?
Well, while it might be tough, the best thing to do is stop using cannabis completely. It's all about giving your body a break.
I can imagine that's easier said than done for some people. Are there other things people can do in the meantime to help manage those awful symptoms?
Definitely hot water therapy, like taking a hot bath or a really hot shower, can provide some temporary relief. It might seem counterintuitive that something as simple as a hot bath could help with such intense nausea and vomiting, but it seems to work for some people.
So are there any other, like, therapies or treatments being explored besides the hot baths, I mean?
Oh yeah, researchers are looking into things like topical capsaicin cream, the stuff that makes chili peppers hot.
Really? What's the thinking behind using capsaicin for CHS?
Well, it seems to mess with the receptors involved in pain and nausea, so it might be able to provide some relief from those specific CHS symptoms.
So we've got hot baths, we've got spicy cream, there's a range of approaches. But it sounds like avoiding cannabis is really the most effective way to deal with CHS, at least for now.
Yeah, abstinence seems to be the key. But luckily, there are a lot of researchers out there who are working hard to understand the biological mechanisms behind CHS.
So what has research uncovered so far? Any breakthroughs?
Well, one of his studies actually found that CHS patients didn't necessarily have higher levels of THC in their hair compared to other cannabis users.
That's interesting. You'd think it'd be the opposite, right? More THC, more problems?
Exactly. It challenges the idea that CHS is simply caused by THC building up in the body. It's clearly more complicated than that.
It seems like every time we learn something new about CHS, it just raises more questions.
Huh.
Led to any promising treatments?
Actually, yeah, one of his clinical trials showed that haloperidol, a medication usually used to treat certain mood disorders, was surprisingly effective in treating CHS symptoms.
Wow, that's a wild connection.
Yeah.
I would never have guessed that. It feels like we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of this whole CHS thing.
Definitely. And that's where organizations like the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, CIHR, are playing such a vital role. They're funding studies to dig deeper into the health and safety aspects of cannabis, especially with the upcoming review of Canada's Cannabis Act.
So there's a chance we might see some changes to cannabis regulations coming up.
It's definitely on the table. One of the big things they're considering is whether to regulate the potency of cannabis concentrates, those high THC products we were talking about.
Given the possible link between high-potency cannabis and CHS, it makes sense that they'd want to look into that.
Absolutely. As we learn more about the potential risks of cannabis use, it's more important than ever to have open and honest conversations about its impact on public health.
Speaking of open and honest conversations, let's widen the lens a bit and think about the bigger implications of what we're learning about CHS.
It's fascinating to consider how the legalization of cannabis in Canada has opened up these new avenues for research, but at the same time, it's highlighted how much we still don't know about the potential risks.
It's like we've stepped into this new world full of possibilities, but we also need to proceed with caution and really understand the terrain.
It really is like exploring uncharted territory. CHS shows us that, there's still so much we don't get about cannabis and what it can do, especially long term.
Yeah, it challenges that whole image of cannabis as this harmless wonder drug, right? CHS throws a wrench in that narrative.
Big time. This deep dive is all about getting a more balanced perspective.
Absolutely. So for the researchers out there trying to crack the CHS code, what are some of the biggest mysteries they're wrestling with?
Well, one of the most baffling things is why some cannabis users get CHS and others don't. Like, is there something genetic going on that makes some folks more susceptible? Or are there specific environmental triggers?
It's that age-old question, nature versus nurture, playing out in the world of cannabis research.
Right. And then there's the whole question of how cannabis, or maybe some specific compounds in it, actually trigger those horrible episodes of nausea and vomiting.
So they're trying to pinpoint the exact biological mechanisms involved.
Exactly. Trying to trace the pathways, figure out the domino effect. We know that quitting cannabis is the most effective way to manage CHS, but we need better strategies for those who might struggle to quit completely.
So finding ways to help people manage those really debilitating symptoms while also trying to get to the root of the problem.
Exactly. And that's why research into alternative therapies, like those medications we talked about, haloperidol, capsaicin cream, is so important. It's about giving people options, helping them find relief.
It seems like the scientific community is in a race against time to understand CHS better.
There's definitely a sense of urgency. As we gather more data, more insights, we need to turn those findings into public health messages, policies, make it practical.
Take it out of the lab and into the real world where it can actually make a difference.
Right. As more places around the world think about legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis, having accurate information, real evidence-based stuff becomes even more important.
We need to give people the knowledge to make smart decisions about their health.
Absolutely. It's a constantly changing situation, and we need to be ready to adapt, update our understanding as new research comes out.
Which is what makes these deep dives so interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Embracing the complexity, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and being open to changing our minds as we learn more.
It's a journey for sure, and the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
CHS is like a perfect example of how the cannabis conversation is evolving. We're moving past those simple narratives, acknowledging that cannabis can have both good and bad effects.
And we can't shy away from those risks, especially as cannabis becomes more accessible. It's time to ditch the black and white thinking and get more nuanced.
And we have to remember that everybody reacts to cannabis differently. What works for one person might not work for another. What seems harmless to one person could have serious consequences for someone else.
Exactly. That's why we need personalized approaches to cannabis use, looking at things like genetics, health history, even lifestyle choices. Empowering people to make choices that work for them, their own unique situation.
Moving away from those blanket statements and recognizing that everyone's relationship with cannabis is going to be different.
And it all starts with knowledge. The more we understand about cannabis, the good, the bad, the complicated, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this new era responsibly.
Ditch the fear, ditch the dogma, and embrace a scientifically informed approach. Definitely. Be your own advocate, ask questions. If you think it might be CHS, bring it up with your doctor, even if they haven't heard much about it.
Sometimes you got to be the one to educate your doctor a little,
That's true. It's a two-way street. The more we can bridge that gap between patients and doctors, the better we can handle complex conditions like CHS.
For sure. So, for our listeners out there, whether they use cannabis or are just curious about it, what's the big takeaway from all this?
What's the one thing they should remember?
I think the most important thing is that cannabis isn't a magic solution for everyone. It's complicated, it affects people differently, and we need to be open-minded but also cautious.
Be informed, be responsible, and make choices that are good for you.
And if you do decide to use cannabis, start slow, see how your body reacts, pay attention to any changes, good or bad.
Listen to your body, it'll tell you what it needs.
Exactly. And never, ever hesitate to talk to a doctor if you have any concerns. Your health is the most important thing.
So there you have it. We went deep into the world of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, a condition that still has researchers scratching their heads. It's a reminder that even though cannabis is becoming more common, we still have a lot to learn about it, especially the potential risks. How do you think our views on this plant, the good and the bad, will change in the years to come? It's a question worth thinking about. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.